Now I'll write the story. New names to use: Mara, narrator, Cole, husband, Judith, mother-in-law, Penny, maid of honor, Grant, attorney, friend. Band names: Claire, Vanessa, Ryan, Beth, Nadia, Marcus, Derek, Mrs. Peterson, Leah, Priya, Gemma, Sophia, Daniel, Jim, Annette, Charlene. My name is Mara, and I am 31 years old. I work as a forensic billing auditor for a regional hospital network in Columbus, Ohio. My job is simple to describe and brutal to perform. I spend 40 hours a week reviewing medical invoices, insurance reimbursements, and vendor contracts, hunting for the numbers that do not belong. Inflated supply orders. Phantom procedures billed to dead patients. Shell vendors collecting payments for services never rendered. I find the lie inside the ledger. I prove it. I hand the file to the lawyers. I have been doing this for 6 years, and in that time, I have developed an allergy to false paperwork that borders on the clinical. At 11:45 on the night before my wedding, I was standing in the hallway of a rented lake house in rural Indiana, barefoot on cold hardwood floors, watching my future mother-in-law crouch in front of my garment bag with a pair of scissors in her hand. She did not hear me come down the stairs. She had unzipped the bag halfway, exposing the ivory shoulder of the gown inside, and she was sawing at the fabric with the scissors in long, deliberate strokes. The sound was a quiet, rhythmic snipping, the kind of sound a person makes when they are not in a hurry because they believe they are entirely alone. I stood in the dark hallway and watched her for exactly 7 seconds. Then I walked back up the stairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and picked up my phone. I texted Cole 2 words. She moved. Cole's reply came in less than 30 seconds. Good. See you at the altar. I set the phone face down on the nightstand. I did not cry. I did not go back downstairs to confront her. I did not call my maid of honor in a panic. I poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher on the dresser, sat back down, and stared at the wall. Judith had just handed me everything I needed. Let me take you back 4 months, to a Tuesday afternoon in February and a catering invoice that was $3,700 too high. Cole and I had been together for 3 years before he proposed. We met at a municipal planning meeting in downtown Columbus. I had been hired to audit the city's vendor contracts for the new hospital annex. Cole was the project manager overseeing the structural timeline. We spent 45 minutes arguing over a discrepancy in the steel delivery schedule before we realized we were on the same side. We went for coffee afterward and never fully stopped talking. Cole grew up in West Haven, a wealthy suburb east of Indianapolis. His father, a man named Robert, had built a successful commercial insurance brokerage over 30 years and passed away when Cole was 26, leaving behind a substantial estate held in trust. Cole had inherited a significant portfolio of commercial properties and an investment account that generated a comfortable annual income. He ran the brokerage himself now, modestly and honestly, the way his father had taught him. Judith ran the estate. This was the arrangement that had existed since Robert's death. Cole had been deep in grief and buried in a business transition, and Judith had stepped in with a leather portfolio and a pleasant, efficient smile. She assured him that managing the trust paperwork was no burden at all. She was his mother. It was the least she could do. Cole believed her. He signed the administrative documents she placed in front of him and went back to work. The first time I met Judith, she shook my hand in the doorway of her condominium in Indianapolis and told me my blazer was a wonderful choice for someone from my background. The compliment and the insult were delivered in the same smooth breath, the way a skilled surgeon makes an incision before you feel the blade. I smiled. I thanked her. I noted the delivery method and filed it away. I had audited enough people to know the difference between someone who was difficult and someone who was dangerous. Difficult people raise their voices. Dangerous people speak in a register of relentless pleasantness while they construct the walls of your cage. Judith was the second kind. She began inserting herself into the wedding planning in March, 3 weeks after we announced our engagement. She sent Cole a detailed email outlining her vision for the reception venue, the catering company, and the floral arrangements. She copied me on the message as a courtesy. The email was warm, generous, and presented as a gift. She wrote that planning a wedding of this caliber required someone with institutional knowledge of the Indianapolis social circuit, and that she simply could not stand by while we navigated it alone. Cole called her that evening and thanked her. I read the attached vendor quotes. The catering estimate was from a company called Harrington & Associates Event Services. The invoice listed a per-head rate of $240 for 140 guests. I opened a new browser tab and searched the company name. Their public pricing page listed their standard per-head rate as $203. The difference was $37 per guest. Across 140 guests, the total inflation was $5,180. I did not mention it to Cole that night. I did not mention it the following morning. I printed the invoice, placed it in a manila folder, and labeled the folder with a date. I have a rule built from years of professional auditing. 1 discrepancy is a mistake. 2 discrepancies are a pattern. 3 discrepancies are a system. I needed to see the system before I moved. Over the following 2 weeks, I requested the remaining vendor contracts from Judith under the pretense of wanting to create a unified budget spreadsheet. She responded promptly and warmly, expressing how touched she was by my organizational initiative. She sent the florist contract, the venue deposit confirmation, and the rehearsal dinner invoices. I spread them across my desk at home on a Thursday evening after Cole left for a work dinner. I opened my laptop. I poured a cup of black coffee. The florist invoice showed a 15% markup above the market rate for comparable arrangements in the Indianapolis area. The venue deposit confirmation listed a required security payment of $18,000. I pulled up the venue's public rate sheet. Their peak season deposit for a full buyout was $11,500. The gap was $6,500. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. 3 contracts. 3 inflated figures. The overage amounts varied in size, but the method was identical. The fake invoices were not forged from scratch. They were legitimate documents with the numbers quietly adjusted. The vendor names were real. The formatting was authentic. The only thing that changed was the dollar amount at the bottom. Judith was not generating paperwork from thin air. She was intercepting real vendor quotes, altering the figures, and presenting the modified versions to us as genuine estimates. She then presumably paid the vendors their actual rates and pocketed the difference from the estate funds she controlled. I totaled the documented discrepancies I had found so far. Across 4 invoices, the overcharge was $14,060. I stared at the number. My hands were steady. My coffee was cooling. For a forensic billing auditor, the mathematics of embezzlement carries its own cold logic. You do not feel rage at the numbers. The numbers are neutral. They simply tell you what happened. What I was looking at was a woman who had found a quiet, low-risk method to siphon money from her son's wedding expenses into her own pocket, confident that the bride would be too intimidated or too distracted to look closely at the paperwork. She had handed forged invoices to a woman who catches forged invoices professionally. I did not close my laptop and confront Cole. I needed more before I could show him anything. 1 month of inflated catering bills was not a conviction. It was an opening argument. I needed the underlying financial architecture. I needed to know how long this had been happening, how much had been taken, and where the money was going. To get that, I needed access to the estate records. And to get that, I needed Judith to be looking somewhere else entirely. The opportunity came in April at a bridal luncheon Judith hosted at her country club in Indianapolis. She had invited 8 women from Cole's extended family and social circle, presenting the event as a warm welcome into the family. The venue was a private dining room off the main club restaurant. The walls were cream paneling and old oil portraits. Everything smelled of furniture polish and expensive restraint. I arrived wearing a structured navy dress. I had my leather portfolio under my arm. Judith greeted me at the door with both hands outstretched, squeezing my fingers with theatrical warmth. She was wearing a pale blush blazer and had her dark hair set in rigid, immaculate curls. She introduced me around the table with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had presided over dozens of social events. Every introduction contained a small, almost imperceptible piece of calibrated information, designed to establish the hierarchy of the room. Mara works in hospital billing, she told Cole's Aunt Patricia. A pleasant enough job, steady hours. Mara grew up in Dayton, she told Cole's cousin, pausing just long enough before the city's name to communicate that the silence itself was meaningful. I watched the table absorb these small editorial notes. I watched the women recalibrate their assessments of me in real time. Judith was managing the room's perception of me with the efficiency of a publicist. She was not saying anything technically hostile. She was simply building a mental file on me in 12 other women's minds, one that labeled me as pleasant, adequate, and entirely out of her league. I smiled warmly at each introduction. I asked thoughtful questions about their families and their work. I laughed at the right moments and listened attentively. 40 minutes into the luncheon, I excused myself to use the restroom. I walked down the carpeted hallway past the restrooms and continued to the club's administrative wing, which I had mapped on a prior visit. I pushed open the door to the small office Judith used when she served as the club's charitable events coordinator. The room was unlocked. Judith was meticulous about her public reputation and trusted entirely in the social codes of the club that no one would ever enter her space uninvited. Her laptop was closed on the desk. I opened it. The screen activated. It was not password protected. People who believe they are untouchable do not prepare for the moment their perimeter fails. I plugged in the small portable drive I had tucked in the interior pocket of my portfolio. I opened the File Explorer. The drive mapped immediately. I had 4 minutes before someone would notice my absence from the luncheon. I opened the folder labeled Hartley Estate Management and began the transfer. The progress bar appeared. I watched it. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, I ejected the drive, closed the laptop, and walked back down the carpet toward the dining room. I stopped in the actual restroom for 90 seconds to reapply lip gloss. When I returned to the table, Judith looked up and offered me a brilliant smile. She asked if everything was all right. I told her the room was lovely, and I was having a wonderful time. That evening, I sat alone at my desk and opened the estate files. It took me 2 hours to find the system. It was not in the wedding vendor invoices. It was deeper and older. Judith had established a home renovation contracting business, registered in Delaware under the name Crestfield Interiors LLC, 7 years ago, 18 months after Robert's death. The LLC had a single client on record, the Hartley Family Trust. Crestfield Interiors had billed the trust $462,000 across 7 years for renovation services performed on estate properties. I pulled the property records for every Hartley estate asset, cross-referenced the billing dates against actual permit filings. Most of the renovations Crestfield invoiced for had never been permitted. Several had never occurred at all. I verified 3 renovation invoices against county inspection records. No permits were ever pulled. No inspectors ever visited the properties. The work had been billed and paid in full, and it had never been performed. $462,000. I set down my pen. Then I opened the operating documents for Crestfield Interiors. The sole managing member listed on the Delaware filing was not Judith's name. It was Cole's. The room went very quiet around me. Judith had forged her son's signature on the registration documents for the shell company and had been using his identity to absorb stolen trust funds for 7 years. If anyone investigated the financial discrepancy, the paper trail led directly to Cole. The billing went out under his name. The LLC receipts showed his signature as the authorizing party. The beneficiary account was shielded behind a faceless registered agent in Wilmington. She had not just stolen from her son. She had built a federal criminal case and signed his name to it. I sat in the quiet of my home office for a long time after that. I was not panicked. I was thinking. This was not a situation where I could walk into a police station the next morning and hand over a drive. Cole would not emerge from that process as a victim. He would emerge as the primary suspect. His name was on the documentation. His signature was on the LLC. His inheritance had funded $462,000 in fabricated contracting invoices. Without the full context of Judith's manipulation, a federal investigator would look at the paperwork and see a wealthy heir siphoning his own trust through a fraudulent construction company to avoid estate taxes. His career would be destroyed. His license to operate the brokerage would be revoked. His father's legacy would be publicly shredded. Judith had built herself a perfect shield. She had made her son the wall between herself and any consequence. I closed the drive and sat in the dark for another hour. Then I opened my notes and started planning. In financial fraud investigation, you never move when you are reactive. You move when you have controlled every variable. The fundamental problem was that Judith's paper architecture was designed specifically to absorb scrutiny. Digital files can be challenged. Signatures can be disputed. Expert witnesses can be hired. High-cost defense attorneys can drag an embezzlement case through years of procedural delays, introducing reasonable doubt at every turn until the truth erodes under the weight of attrition. What I needed was a physical crime, an unambiguous, observable, recorded act that demonstrated Judith's consciousness of guilt, something that no attorney could explain away as clerical error or misunderstanding. To produce that crime, I needed Judith to panic. She operated on the deep assumption that her fraud was invisible. She had spent 7 years with perfect results. No investigation, no audit, no questions. She believed the people around her were either too trusting or too intimidated to look at her paperwork closely. If she suddenly believed that a physical piece of evidence existed that could dismantle her entire legal shelter, she would not behave rationally. She would not call her attorney. She would not quietly disappear. She was not built for graceful retreat. She was built for dominance, and dominance requires eliminating the threat. If I could make her believe that a tangible object existed within her reach that connected her directly to the fraud, she would try to destroy it. And when she did, she would destroy herself. I needed a decoy, something she could find and something she could not resist. Cole and I sat together in our living room on a Wednesday night 3 weeks before the wedding. I laid out everything I had found. I watched his face as he worked through the documents. The color left his skin slowly, the way light fades at the end of a long day. He did not speak for several minutes after I showed him the LLC registration with his forged signature. When he finally looked up, his eyes were very steady. He said, "Tell me what we need to do." I told him. He did not hesitate. He said yes. The plan had 3 components. The first was Penny. My maid of honor and closest friend from college is a corporate attorney who now works in commercial litigation in Chicago. She handles contract disputes and financial fraud cases. I called her on a Thursday morning and explained the situation in clean, factual language. She did not gasp or offer sympathy. She asked 2 questions about the Delaware registration, confirmed the relevant federal statutes, and asked what her role was. I told her. She said she would drive down that Friday. The second component was Grant. Cole's closest friend from graduate school had spent the last decade building a practice in white-collar defense. He understood the mechanics of federal fraud prosecution from the inside. He had handled 3 embezzlement cases involving offshore LLCs, and he knew precisely how to frame forged documentation in a way that federal prosecutors could not ignore. Cole reached out to him on a Thursday evening. Grant flew in from Atlanta 2 days before the wedding. The third component was the decoy. 3 days before the ceremony, we held the final dress fitting at the lake house in Indiana, where the wedding weekend was taking place. Judith had insisted on hosting the wedding at a property adjacent to an estate she frequently borrowed from an old family friend. She presented the arrangement as a generous gift, and we had agreed to it months earlier, before I understood what she was actually doing. The lake house had 12 rooms across 3 floors. The bridal suite was on the 2nd floor at the end of a long hallway with original hardwood floors that creaked in a specific sequence that Judith, having stayed at the property many times, knew precisely. The fitting took place in the bridal suite. The seamstress finished her work and left. Penny and I remained. The door was open exactly 2 inches. I had listened to Judith's movements in the house all morning. She made a habit of finding reasons to pass the bridal suite hallway. She had checked on us twice already under the pretense of offering beverages. Penny and I stood in the room. The garment bag hung on the back of the closet door. Penny positioned herself so her voice would carry cleanly through the gap in the doorway. I gave her a small nod. Penny dropped her voice into a low, urgent register. "Mara, I need you to think carefully about this. If you're carrying that kind of documentation into the ceremony, she will find out." I let a beat pass. I responded in a tone that was deliberately strained, like someone working to stay calm. "She's not going to find it." I pulled all the original deposit transfer receipts, the ones with her actual handwriting in the margin notes. I scanned them, but I kept the physical copies too. The physical documents prove the LLC shell was hers, Penny, not Cole's. Her annotations are right there, next to his forged signature. Any handwriting examiner in the country would confirm it in 20 minutes. Where are they? I sewed them into the bodice lining of the dress. I stitched a small envelope into the interior seam. She would have to cut the entire gown apart to get to them, and I am not taking the dress off until after the ceremony. The moment the reception ends, we go straight to Grant. I watched the floorboards in the hallway. A specific board 4 feet from the door had a distinctive creak. It had not made that sound in the last hour. It made it now. Penny and I held the silence. Neither of us moved. A long pause. Then the soft sound of feet retreating toward the staircase. I let out a slow breath. Penny looked at me. She did not smile. She said, she heard every word. The next 36 hours required a specific kind of patience that I can only describe as professionally disciplined grief. I had full knowledge of what Judith intended to do. Cole had full knowledge. Penny had full knowledge. And yet we sat through 2 family dinners, a rehearsal walkthrough, and a casual sunset gathering at the lake dock, and we smiled and we passed the bread and we thanked Judith for the flower arrangements she had personally overseen. Cole was extraordinary. He has a structural engineer's understanding of load distribution. He knows how to bear weight without cracking. At the rehearsal dinner, when Judith made a pointed toast that described our union as a considerable adjustment for all of us, Cole raised his glass and nodded in her direction with a warmth so convincing that the 30 guests present absorbed nothing unusual from his posture. Grant sat at the far end of the dinner table wearing a charcoal blazer and a pleasant expression. He spent 20 minutes in conversation with Judith's financial advisor, a man named Howard who managed the trust accounts. He asked Howard 2 specific questions about Delaware entity law in a conversational tone that Howard took as social curiosity. Howard answered both questions fully. Grant caught my eye across the table when Howard looked away. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The trap was armed. After the dinner, after the dock gathering, after the guests retired to their rooms, I lay awake in the dark of the bridal suite and listened to the house. Cole was in the ground floor guest room, as tradition required. Penny was next door to me. The garment bag hung on the closet door, the ivory shoulder of the decoy dress visible through the transparent panel at the top. I want to be specific about that dress. I purchased it 7 weeks earlier from a consignment shop in Columbus for $65. It was polyester with a lace overlay and a long back zipper. I had hung it in my apartment for a week, then transported it to the lake house in the same garment bag as my real outfit. The decoy had been hanging in that bridal suite closet for 3 days, in clear sight of anyone who passed the room. Judith had seen it twice. She knew exactly where it was. I dozed at some point. I am not sure when. The house was very still and then I was awake. Fully, without transition, the way you go from sleep to alert when a sound has already passed, but your nervous system has registered it. I sat up. I waited 4 seconds. Then I walked barefoot to the hallway door and opened it without sound. I looked down the hallway. At the far end, in the weak light coming from the window above the staircase landing, Judith was crouching in front of the closet door. The garment bag was half open. The scissors in her hand were moving. I watched for 7 seconds. Then I went back to the bed and texted Cole. She moved. His reply was immediate. Good. See you at the altar. I set down the phone. I sat with the silence for a moment. Somewhere in the house, a woman who had spent years treating her son's life as a financial instrument was methodically cutting apart a $65 polyester dress because she believed it contained the only document that could send her to federal prison. I picked up the small weatherproof camera I had mounted inside the decorative wreath on the closet door 48 hours earlier. I ejected the memory card and placed it on the nightstand. Then I put on my robe and went downstairs to make coffee. The memory card footage was everything. Penny and Grant and Cole and I sat in the kitchen at 2:30 in the morning, watching the screen of my laptop. The camera had a clean angle. The night vision was sharp. You could see Judith's face in profile as she worked. You could see the specific, deliberate motion of the scissors. You could hear the sound of the fabric in the audio track. Grant watched the footage twice. Then, he opened his laptop and began composing. We spent the next 3 hours preparing the materials. Cole assembled the guest contact list. Grant drafted the formal documentation attaching the forged LLC registration, the annotated transfer records I had recovered from the estate files, and the arson footage. Penny reviewed the legal framing and confirmed the relevant federal statutes. At 6 in the morning, the automated email was scheduled to send at 8:15, 90 minutes before the ceremony began. We did not sleep. At 8:15, 206 people received the email on their phones. At 9:45, we arrived at the small historic church 10 minutes from the lake house. I did not wear the decoy dress. I wore my grandmother's suit. My grandmother raised 4 children as a single mother in Cleveland, Ohio, after my grandfather left in 1971. She worked as a bookkeeper for a commercial shipping company for 31 years. She wore this suit to her retirement party in 2002. It is cream-colored wool, tailored and structural, with wide lapels and a single row of covered buttons. She gave it to my mother, and my mother gave it to me the year before she passed. I had it pressed and steamed in Columbus before I drove to Indiana. It fit like it was built for me. I did my hair simply. I carried no flowers. I wore my grandmother's small pearl earrings. Penny stood next to me outside the church entrance as the guests filed in. She looked at me for a long moment and said only, "She's not going to know what hit her." I said, "She already doesn't." Judith arrived at 12 minutes to 10. She had dressed with extraordinary care. She was wearing a floor-length gown in a pale champagne color, a shade deliberately selected to suggest bridal adjacency. I knew this because I had found the designer's confirmation email on her laptop during my earlier access. She had purchased the gown 4 weeks ago. The order note read, "Mother of the groom, formal occasion, must stand out." She walked across the stone courtyard toward the church entrance with the unhurried authority of a woman arriving for her own celebration. Her posture was high and composed. Her expression was a careful arrangement of gracious maternal nobility. She had spent the night believing she had eliminated the threat. She had cut apart the decoy dress in the dark, confident that the fabricated documents she imagined were now confetti. She would have slept soundly for the remaining hours before dawn, dreaming of the broken bride who would have nothing left to show for her accusations. She expected to walk into this church and find a postponed ceremony, or a devastated groom, or, at best, a humiliated woman in borrowed clothes attempting to carry on with no evidence and no leverage. She did not expect to find the parking lot full. She paused at the edge of the courtyard. She looked at the line of cars. She looked at the valet attendants. A small crease appeared between her brows. She walked up the steps and through the entrance doors into the church. I know what she found because Penny was watching from inside the vestibule. Penny described it to me afterward in exact detail. 206 guests were seated and present. Every row was full. The ceremony music was playing. The flowers were in place. The officiant was at the altar. The church smelled of white roses and beeswax candles and the particular clean air of a room in which important things are about to happen. No chaos, no cancellation, no grieving groom. Judith walked into the nave. The room changed when she entered. It did not go loud. It went still. The particular stillness of a room in which 200 people have just received the same piece of information and are waiting to see what the subject of that information will do. She walked down the center aisle. The guests did not lean toward her. They pulled back. Shoulders angled away. Eyes tracked her with an attention that had nothing to do with admiration. She passed the row where Cole's Aunt Patricia was seated. Patricia was one of the people who had sent me a pointed text message in March, referencing my background and suggesting Cole might benefit from a prenuptial agreement. Patricia had clearly absorbed and repeated whatever narrative Judith had been circulating about me. Patricia looked at Judith now with an expression I was not there to see, but which Penny described as the look of a woman who has just realized the map she was given was drawn by the person who wanted her to get lost. Judith reached the front pew. She saw Grant. Grant was seated in the first row on the right. He was wearing the same charcoal blazer from the rehearsal dinner. He sat with his legs crossed and a sealed manila envelope resting on his knee. When Judith's eyes reached him, he looked at her steadily and gave a single nod. He placed one finger on the envelope. Judith's composure fractured. Not dramatically, not in a way the back rows would have caught. But Penny was 3 feet away, and she said it happened behind the eyes first. Something went out. Cole stood at the altar. He did not look at his mother with warmth. He looked at her with a clinical stillness that she would not have seen from him before because she had never given him a reason to use it. She sank into the front pew. She was still there, rigid and white-faced, when the music shifted. The doors at the back of the church opened. I walked in. I wore my grandmother's cream wool suit. I walked at a measured pace with my chin level. I had no veil. I had no bouquet. I had my grandmother's pearl earrings and the knowledge of every number and every document I had recovered over the past 4 months. The guests rose. I want to be honest about what I felt walking down that aisle. It was not triumph. It was not vindication. It was something quieter and more permanent. It was the particular clarity you feel when you have followed a trail of numbers to its source and confirmed that your methodology was sound. The satisfaction is not loud. It does not shout. It simply sits in the chest and holds steady. I passed Judith's row without looking at her. Cole stepped down from the altar as I reached the front. He took my hands. His grip was strong. He looked at the wool suit and understood everything it represented without needing to be told. We did not turn immediately to the officiant. We turned to Judith. Cole reached into his jacket and removed the wireless microphone the officiant had been holding. He did not speak loudly. He did not need to. The acoustics of the old church carried everything to every corner. He said, "I need to say something before we begin." The room did not make a sound. He looked at his mother in the front pew. She looked back at him with the desperate, searching expression of someone waiting to see which version of her son had shown up to the altar. The version that made excuses for her, or the version that had spent the past 3 weeks reviewing forged Delaware banking documents and watching footage of her cutting apart a dress with scissors at midnight. She found out. Cole described the Crestfield Interiors, LLC. He stated the full amount. $462,000. He said the name of the registered agent in Wilmington and the routing numbers of the accounts the funds were moved through. He said his father's name once, with care. He said, "You used my name to steal from the trust my father built for our family. You forged my signature on federal documents. You used the legal architecture of my identity as a shield for your fraud. And last night you destroyed what you believed was the only physical evidence that connected those documents to you." He paused. He said, it was a $65 dress from a consignment shop. The documents had been in a secure, encrypted server for 6 weeks. Judith stood up. She did not stand up gracefully. She pushed up from the pew with both hands and lurched forward. She grabbed Cole's jacket sleeve with both hands. Her voice came out in a high, tight register that bore no resemblance to the cultivated social ease she had performed for 35 years. She told him I had manipulated him. She told the room I had fabricated the documentation. She said the words "she is not one of us" in a voice that cracked down the center, and I watched several guests in the 5th and 6th rows register exactly what that phrase revealed about the woman saying it. Cole did not pull away from her grip. He looked down at her hands on his sleeve for a moment. Then he reached up and removed her fingers one at a time, carefully, the way you handle something that is broken. He handed the microphone back to the officiant. He walked to my side. Grant stood up from the first row. He crossed to where Judith was standing and held out the manila envelope. She stared at it. Her breathing was audible. Her manicured hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. She took the envelope. She dropped it. It hit the stone floor and the clasp opened and the paper spread across the marble. The top page was a still image from the camera footage. Judith at the closet door, the scissors in her hand, her face turned slightly toward the camera. She looked at it on the floor. She looked at her son. Cole said, "The police report was filed at 6 this morning. Grant filed the federal disclosure at 7. The email with the documentation went to everyone in this room at 8:15. Whatever you want to say next, there is no version of it that changes what the numbers show." He turned away from her and looked at me. 2 men who had been standing quietly near the back of the church walked forward. They moved at an unhurried pace, with the particular authority of people who have performed this kind of exit many times and feel no urgency in it. Judith made one more sound. It was not words. It was the sound of a person who has been running hard for a long time and has just realized the ground beneath them has ended. The 2 men guided her out. The oak doors closed. The church was quiet. Somewhere in the middle rows, a woman began to applaud, then a man in the 7th row. Then the sound spread outward from the center, row by row, until the full length of the nave was holding a standing ovation that ricocheted against the stained glass windows and the old stone walls. Cole squeezed my hands. We turned to the officiant. He looked at us for a moment over the top of his reading glasses. Then he smiled with the quiet joy of a man who has performed hundreds of ceremonies and knows when he is witnessing the real thing. He opened his book. 6 months after the wedding, Cole and I are living in a house we bought in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus. It is a 1920s brick 4-square with original hardwood floors and a small backyard where I have been unsuccessfully attempting to grow tomatoes since August. We eat dinner at the kitchen table most nights. We talk about work and architecture and where we want to travel. On Sunday mornings, Cole brings home pastries from the bakery 2 blocks away. We sit at the table with our coffee and the newspaper, and we are, by every honest measure, content. The federal case moved quickly. Grant had structured the evidence package with deliberate prosecutorial clarity. Judith's defense attorneys attempted to negotiate a settlement that would keep the proceedings out of public record. The district attorney declined. The documentation was too clean. The footage was too specific. A settlement offer is a meaningful negotiation tool when the evidence is ambiguous. When you have wire transfer records, forged LLC documentation, and video of the defendant attempting to destroy physical evidence, the leverage flows in one direction. She accepted a plea agreement in late September. The terms required full financial restitution. The trust received $462,000 back, drawn from the liquidation of Judith's private assets. Her condominium in Indianapolis sold in October. Her investment accounts were surrendered. She was placed on 5 years of supervised probation with strict prohibitions on managing any financial accounts or executing any contracts. The social consequences arrived faster than the legal ones. The Indianapolis social circuit is small and has a long institutional memory. Cole's Aunt Patricia sent a handwritten note of apology in July. Richard Weston, a prominent commercial banker who had been a close friend of Cole's father and who had sat in the 12th row of the church on our wedding day, called Cole in August to tell him he would be glad to serve as a character reference or business reference in any capacity Cole needed. Judith now lives in a 1-bedroom apartment on the west side of Indianapolis. She is, by all accounts, entirely unremarked upon by the community in which she spent 30 years demanding to be remarkable. I think about her sometimes, not with anger. Anger requires ongoing investment, and I am a person who allocates my resources toward things that compound over time. I think about the mechanics of what she did, the patience of it, the years of careful construction, the way she identified every potential threat and systematically neutralized it, the particular arrogance of believing that the people around you will never look at the numbers because they trust you, the way that arrogance becomes its own vulnerability. I have a small framed rectangle on the wall of my home office above the desk where I do my work. Inside the frame is a piece of cream polyester lace, cut at a ragged angle. I retrieved it from the hall outside the bridal suite the morning after she took the scissors to it. People ask me sometimes why I keep it. They assume it is a trophy, a reminder of winning. It is not that. It is a reminder of methodology, of the gap between what a person believes they are doing and what they are actually doing. Judith believed she was eliminating evidence. She was manufacturing it. She believed she was operating invisibly. She was being recorded. She believed the person she was most afraid of had no paper trail. The paper trail had been in a secured server in Northern Virginia for 6 weeks. The gap between what a person believes is true and what is actually true is the territory where all investigative work lives. I have spent my professional life in that gap, following numbers to their source, demonstrating what the record shows when you look at it honestly. My grandmother kept her books with a mechanical pencil and a yellow legal pad. She balanced her household accounts to the penny every Sunday evening at the kitchen table. She raised 4 children on a bookkeeper's salary, and she never once told a number to be something it was not. I am her granddaughter. The numbers do not lie. They wait. I sit at my desk most evenings now, in the house Cole and I bought in Columbus, with the lamp on and the neighborhood quiet outside the window. Sometimes I look up at the small frame above my monitor, the piece of cream polyester lace with the ragged scissor edge, and I think about cause and consequence. Not in any grand spiritual sense, just the plain, observable mechanics of it, what a person chooses to do, and what that choice builds around them over time. Judith was not a stupid woman. That is the part people find hardest to accept when I tell this story. She was organized, patient, and genuinely skilled at reading people. She had spent decades studying the social architecture of wealth and learning exactly which levers to pull to keep others off balance. She ran a 7-year fraud with near-perfect operational discipline. The invoices were clean, the entity structure was sound, The forged signature was meticulous. If she had applied that same intelligence toward anything honest, she would have been formidable in the best possible way. But she aimed all of it at control, at diminishing the people around her so she could remain the tallest thing in the room. And that is where the whole structure started leaning. Because here is what I have learned. Both professionally and in every other way, a system built on false numbers cannot hold indefinitely. It does not matter how elegant the architecture is. Eventually, the discrepancy surfaces. The gap between what the record says and what actually happened becomes visible to someone who knows where to look. Judith spent 7 years assuming no one would look. She assumed that the people around her, her son, his future wife, the family friends, the social circle, were either too trusting or too distracted or too intimidated to examine the paperwork. She handed those documents to someone who examines paperwork for a living. That is not luck. That is consequence. When you build your life on the premise that other people are less capable than you are, you stop preparing for the possibility that they are not. You leave the laptop unlocked. You do not password protect the estate folders. You eavesdrop in hallways without checking what the floorboards sound like from the other side of the door. Your arrogance becomes the gap in your own perimeter. Cole carried something heavy for a long time after the wedding. The grief of it was real, and I never minimized that. There is a specific kind of loss that comes from realizing a parent was not who you believed them to be. Not a gradual disappointment, but a structural collapse. The whole building coming down at once. He mourned his father's memory in a new way, understanding now what Robert had actually built and what had been done to it. That mourning was honest, and it took time. What I admire about Cole, what I admired from the very first time we argued over a steel delivery schedule in a conference room in downtown Columbus, is that he does not run from accurate information. He sits with it. He processes it. He updates his understanding of the world to match what the evidence actually shows, even when the evidence is painful. That is not a small thing. Most people, when confronted with a truth that dismantles something they love, find a way to make the truth smaller. Cole made himself larger instead. I think about that when I think about what we are building together now. The house, the work, the Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper and the tomatoes in the backyard that still will not grow properly. None of it is dramatic. All of it is real. And it is built on a foundation that was tested before the first stone was laid. My grandmother balanced her books to the penny every Sunday evening for 31 years. She never asked for recognition for it. She just kept the numbers honest because she understood, in the bone-deep way that people who have actually struggled understand things, that a false number does not stay false quietly. It spreads. It compounds. It eventually demands payment from the person who introduced it with interest. Judith is learning that now. Slowly, in a one-bedroom apartment on the west side of Indianapolis, with no invitations arriving and no one returning her calls. The ledger always settles. It just works on its own schedule.